Well, welcome to Meck's Online Campus. Are you going to root for Kansas City in the big game or God's team, the Philadelphia Eagles? Yes, I'm going to root for the Eagles, but I'm a Panthers fan. My big sport, though, growing up was actually basketball. I played basketball all through junior high and high school and was even set to try and go walk-on in college. And then I worked my way through the first part of my graduate school years by coaching basketball. Now, having been coached for many years and have served as a coach myself, I have come to the conclusion that one of the most significant, powerful, important skills that a coach can possess is knowing when to call a timeout and then knowing how to use that time that you've called a timeout for. There's no doubt in my mind that it can determine whether a game is won or lost. You know, when you're out on the court as a player, the action it's just fast and it's furious. There really isn't a lot of time to think or reflect. You just react. That's why practice matters so much, because you can just go into reactionary mode. But if it starts to go south, if your reactions aren't going quite right, the shots don't fall, the other team gets into a zone, there's not a lot you can do on the court except to try and run and jump and play harder. And that takes energy, a lot of energy. And pretty soon your legs just feel like they're made out of lead and you start getting sloppy and you start making all kinds of mistakes. And it's at that point that a good coach knows to just, call for time. He'll stop the game and everybody will get a chance to catch their breath, and reflect on what's going on and regroup and get some objective coaching about what's happening out there on the court. And then after the timeout, you're able to go back out onto the court and pick up the game where you left off. And you're able to then play a little better, a little smarter, a little sharper. We're in a series on the Ten Commandments. And last week we kicked it off with the first three, all of which we kind of let hang together. We talked about them as a group because they all dealt with how we relate to God. Here's a quick recap. The first commandment was about God saying, "Put me first." The second commandment was, "Make sure it's me." And the third commandment was, "Take me seriously." Today we come to the fourth on his top 10 list. And that fourth commandment can be boiled down to one thing: calling for time. The fourth commandment is rooted in the creation narrative itself, specifically the seventh and final day of creation. Here's how the events of that day are recorded in the first book of the Bible, Genesis. So the creation of the heavens and the earth and everything in them was completed. On the seventh day, God had finished his work of creation, so he rested from all his work. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because it was the day when he rested from all his work of creation. Now, obviously, this is poetic language. An omnipotent God does not need to rest. The meaning of the word is that he stopped his creative work. And the reason is because there was nothing else he wanted to form, nothing else he wanted to fill. It was complete. It was done. It was perfect. It was good. So he rested from creation. He ceased creating on that seventh day. And from that came a rhythm to the human week, set in motion by the creation itself. 7 days with the seventh day for rest. Now, fast forward to the time when God called the people of Israel together into a nation under the leadership of Moses. They were undisciplined, undiscipled, needing direction, needing guidelines for spiritual living and how to be in a relationship with God and with each other. And getting a whole bunch of instruction all at once could have been overwhelming. So while God gave Moses a heck of a lot, he distilled it all into 10 commands. Commands designed to serve our life, breathe into our life, optimize our life. And the fourth one was about taking that seventh day rhythm and making it an abiding dynamic in their life. So let's take a look at it. In the fourth commandment, God says, "Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. But on the seventh day he rested. This is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy." Now, to get a handle on that commandment, let's define some terms and ideas. First, let's talk about the word Sabbath and what that's all about. It's so often misunderstood. The word Sabbath doesn't mean Sunday, doesn't mean Saturday, doesn't even mean a worship service. The word Sabbath literally means to cease, to stop, to quit, to rest. And that's why an extended rest or stop is called a sabbatical. Now, for the word holy means something that is different, set apart, unique, unlike anything else. Something that is not like the other things, or in this case, not like other times. You might not have known it, but that's why we call holidays holidays. It literally is a modification of the word holy day. The idea behind labor, next word, is pretty self-explanatory. It has to do with our regular work and daily duties. And then the concept of doing something to the Lord means that you dedicate it to Him. You give it to Him. He's woven into it. So let's see if we can add all this up. The fourth commandment is saying that every 7 days, call for time. Stop the game. You are to have 1 day in 7 that is not like the other 6 days. They are to be a Sabbath, a real rest that will serve both you and your relationship with God. And God put this on His list for a very important reason. He cares about us. He wants us to live life the way it is meant to be lived. He knew that if He did not direct us, challenge us, command us to call for time, we would forget that there is more to life than work. Because that's our tendency, to not Sabbath, to not rest. I think most of us are familiar with the term workaholic. You know, it was coined by Dr. Wayne Oates in 1968 in an article he wrote for a psychology journal. I actually studied under Dr. Oates during part of my graduate school years. You couldn't forget Dr. Oates. He had a finger that had been partially cut off, and when he was making a point, he'd wave his nub at us. Kind of made you remember the point. And even if you didn't remember the point, you remembered the finger. He coined the term workaholic because of his observation that work is like a narcotic. It can become addictive and compulsive, something that can be difficult to handle with restraint and moderation. And this can come in all kinds of forms and ways and packages and styles and personality types. I've read it netted out in at least half a dozen ways. For example, there are people who are identity workaholics. Our work defines us. It tells us who we are, so we build our lives around it because it is our life. We live for the recognition, the awards, the prestige. Some of us are perfectionists. We put in the long hours because something within us just has to make everything perfect. You know, we're a 1 on the Enneagram. We can't stand anything less. Some of us do it for approval. We work hard. We work and work and work because we're afraid of saying no to anybody's request for our time and energy. We are pleasers, so we stay late and we work through the weekend. Some of us are situational workaholics. We tell ourselves that the long hours are only temporary. They'll soon pass, but of course, then there's always another situation and another crisis and another season, and so it never ends. So every night, the laptop comes home and the briefcase full. Some of us are escapists, workaholics, because we don't want to have to face what is outside of work or what waits for us at home, such as maybe a troubled marriage. Or so we stay at work because it's safe and we don't have to deal with the outside world at least as much. We fill as much of our time as we possibly can with work. I don't know if you've watched the series Severance on Apple. Susan and I are absolutely hooked. I really recommend it. It's fun TV. But don't start watching season 2, though. You got to go back and watch season 1 from the beginning because it's confusing enough already as it is. But it's fun TV. But the premise, which doesn't do it justice, but the premise is about people who have chosen to have a chip implanted in their brains that makes it so that when they go to work, when they exit the elevator and enter their work floor, they instantly forget their outside lives. They're severed that way. And they did it because, for whatever reason, they wanted to. They wanted to escape from that world into their work world. Well, we may not have chips in our brain, but a lot of people do sever their home life from their work life because they don't want to face what is on the outside. Well, then there's obviously the materialist workaholic. This is when you want more and more and more of what money brings you, so you work and work and work and work to get it. In fact, USA Today did a survey once that asked people whether they would work an 80-hour a week for a few years, an 80-hour week for several years, if there was potential for a large financial payoff, despite what it would do to their marriage, their family, their personal life, their children. About half said no, because their personal life was too important. But about half said yes, that they would because a financial payoff was worth just about everything to them, even if it resulted in wayward kids and a divorce. But regardless of what kind of workaholic we might be, Oates was right in the word he chose. It can be an addiction. and few addictions are healthy. And left untreated, it will do great harm to our life. But it's not just our temptation toward workaholism that has us on God's list. Our entire collective way of life has led to what Richard Swinson has called marginless living. Margin is the space that exists between ourselves and our limits. Limits are real. We weren't meant to live life on overload. It's meant to be lived within limits. But the fast-paced nature of our modern world has removed what room we have to breathe, and a lot of us are experiencing that overload, now more than ever. If you think about just how radically different the way we're living now than even just a handful of generations ago, and the way people had lived for, centuries and millennia before that, there were no televisions to watch. There was no phones to answer. There were no cars. There was no electricity that extended daylight hours. But now we live in a world that is always on, and we're always connected. I was reading another researcher, Dr. Martin Moore-Eddy, who wrote a book called The 24-Hour Society. And in that book, he charts how we have developed a society that never sleeps, that never quits, never stops. And I remember reading his conclusion being very blunt and to the point. He said, we are not built for the world we have made. Why? Because we have designed a world that ignores the law of limits. It's like a bank account that we keep making withdrawals from, but never any deposits. And it's self-inflicted. It really is. While time pressures are real, traffic does get congested. It is tough being a working parent. Young kids are, deal breakers. I understand. But the facts are that the length of our workday in America is shorter now than ever before. We have more leisure time than ever before, more time-saving devices than ever before. Time isn't flying. We are. In the fourth commandment, God says, don't do it. There comes a time when enough is enough, and you have to say that enough is enough. Because if you don't, you'll end up in a fetal position. You'll self-destruct. You'll go beyond exhaustion and enter into burnout and collapse and a breakdown. At some point, you'll fill your life with this constant, unending stream of tasks and deadlines and quotas and engagements, and you will hit the wall. You'll turn around, and that daughter you thought was 8 will be 12. Your marriage will be suffering. Your fuse will be so short, you will be dreaming about road rage. When we race here and push it there and extend ourselves somewhere else, when we run the race as hard as we can without ever stopping to catch our breath, when work or school or activities and events, schedules and timelines become the defining activity of our life, when we don't take time to rest and turn ourselves toward personal and emotional and spiritual renewal, what doesn't suffer? Our relationships suffer, we lose perspective on life, we crash and burn emotionally, and we lose touch with God. The stress, the fatigue, the anxiety, the tension, the burden, the pressure is just too much. Something has to give, and something does. We either get worn out physically, drained or burned out emotionally, or lose all perspective on things spiritually, or, as often the case, all three. So in the fourth commandment, we have an expression of God's incredible love and concern and compassion for us. He says, don't do that to yourselves. That's not how you were made or what you were made for. So God says, here's the game plan. Listen carefully, because I'm the coach. Every week, I'm going to call for time for your life. Let the clock stop, the contest be put on pause, the action allowed to cease. Catch your breath, get a grip, put some gas in your tank, and just take some time on the bench. It's not only legal, it is necessary. That is, if you want to play the entire game and play it to win. So how do you do it? How do you call for time? Well, it's really not complicated, but it does take doing 4 very specific things, and you can't leave any of them out, okay? First, you have to set aside the day. You have to mark it down. Plan it out. Put it on your calendar. Don't forget, this really is a commandment. It's funny how we forget that. In fact, I think this is the only one of the 10 commandments that we boast about breaking, almost as if it's a badge of honor. I mean, have you ever listened to kind of how we talk? I work 80-hour weeks, haven't taken a vacation in months, or, I crunch through at least 75 emails before lunch. How about you? Or, I've been home for dinner in 2 weeks. I was up till 3 last night. Or someone says, well, I did 4 coast-to-coast red-eyes this month alone. And we say it boasting, almost like it's a badge of honor. Would we do that with any of the other commandments? Yeah, I lied 4 times today. How about you? Shoot, that's nothing. I lusted twice before breakfast. I'm going to try to get adultery in before the day's out. Well, I was able to take the Lord's name in vain 37 times this week. Heck, I stole more from my company this year than the last 3 years combined. We don't talk that way. The first step is to take this as a step. Make it a commandment, Take a day and set it aside with purposeful intent. Now, here's what you'll want to do. Rather than a whole day every week, you'll tell yourself that you'll take little Sabbaths and little rests and little breaks all throughout the week, and then use that to justify working every day, having work invade all 7 days. But little breaks don't give you what a full one-day break gives you. Let me tell you what God didn't say. Okay, let me read that 4th commandment the way we sometimes want it to read. Remember Sabbath moments by keeping them holy. 7 days you shall labor and do all your work, but every now and then when you think about it, take 60 seconds for a Sabbath to the Lord your God. During that minute, you shall not do any work. Okay, that's not what it said. Folks, God says take a day because he knows it needs a day. It takes a day. You have to get things out of your system. You got to allow yourself to detach from things physically and emotionally and mentally for a sustained period of time. Only when that kind of break comes do you really get a break. Now, which day you do it is really your call. The Sabbath was originally on Saturday, and that's still the practice of Jews. When Christianity began launched onto the scene, began to spread, there was an immediate movement towards Sunday as the Sabbath day because that was the day Jesus was resurrected. And that has been the tradition and practice of Christians for 2,000 years. But which day of the week you use for the Sabbath isn't as important as having a day of the week that you use for the Sabbath. The point is to set aside a day. For me, it's not Sunday. It's not Saturday. For me, it's Friday. Rumor has it I work weekends. The rhythm of my week, and for most of our staff, is to work Sunday through Thursday. And our Sabbath is worked out in various ways over Friday and Saturday. For most people, though, it will be a Sunday. But make no mistake, setting aside that day will be, has to be an act of the will. Has to be. It won't come naturally. It won't come easily. It's something that you're going to have to be intentional about. So that's first. Here's the second specific. After you set aside that day, rest on that day, which means don't work. You say, okay, I get that. Okay, maybe you do, but probably you don't. Most of us are so pathetic, we need it spelled out like we're in kindergarten. So here's what no work means. It means you don't work most of that day and take a 2-hour break. It means you don't bring home a stack of books about your job to read. It means you don't use that time to plan out another week's worth of work. It means you don't take calls, keep up with work texts, or check and respond to email. Let me repeat that. It means you don't check and respond to email. Let me say it again with feeling. It means you don't check and respond to email. A Sabbath rest means you don't work. Period. It means you don't think about work, talk about work, read about work, plan about work. And that doesn't just mean office work. And by the way, if you're sitting there thinking, but I love my work and my work brings me renewal, now you need counseling. But the kind of labor doesn't just mean office work, but also the kind of labor that is part of the day in, day out routine that fills your life. Washing clothes, mopping the floor, running errands. You can stay away from your work related to your job and fill it with other kinds of work in a heartbeat. And that's what a lot of us do with our weekends. We may not work at the office or bring anything home with us, but we cram it weekends so full of errands and tasks and chores that would make what we do on a Monday look tame. But you say, but I have to. And God would say, well, no, you don't have to. You could have prepared your week, scheduled your week, thought about your week in such a way as to make that a day of rest. And you didn't. When the Bible says to take a day to rest, it means to take a day to rest, to stop, to quit, and to do whatever it takes on the front end to make it possible. Okay, here's the third specific. After you set aside a day, and after you've made the decision to really rest on it, then you need to do things that renew yourself with it. You need to renew yourself. Do something on that day or a series of things on that day that puts gas in your tank. If it's sailing, get out on the water. If it's golf, get out on the course. If it's jogging, walking, streaming a movie, playing tennis, reading a novel, sewing, working out in your yard, gardening, biking, do it. Some of you may have felt that the fourth commandment meant that you weren't supposed to do anything like that on a Sunday. Actually, that you weren't supposed to do anything at all on the Sabbath. That is so wrong. And Jesus went out of his way to let people know it was wrong. Let's talk about Jesus and the Sabbath for a minute, because this is a good time to kind of chase that rabbit. There was a group of people in Jesus' day known as Pharisees. They were very concerned about the difference between them and their pagan neighbors. They wanted to make sure that the difference between them was clear. And there were three main things that in their minds set them apart because they were tangible, unmistakable, physical, noticeable things. Circumcision, dietary food laws. They would only eat foods considered kosher, and the word kosher just means things that are fit or proper. And so they had laws, so it would be like beef but not pork, and chicken but not shellfish. And then honoring the Sabbath, which among Jews was honored on Saturday. Actually, technically, it began on sunset Friday and lasted until after dark on Saturday night. And of those three, it was the Sabbath that set things up between Jesus and the Pharisees. I mean, all Jewish boys, including Jesus, were circumcised on the 8th day after their birth, so that wasn't a big deal. A practice that is far from restricted, obviously, in Jewish life. Around 80% of all men in America are circumcised. Jesus also seemed to follow their dietary laws, though he set his followers free from all that following his resurrection. But the one thing he did not follow by the letter of the law at all were all the rules surrounding the Sabbath that had built up over time. It had become so distorted, made a burden, turned into something God had never intended. And I do mean never intended. The Pharisees had even made a list of, get this, 1,521 specific things that you were not supposed to do on the Sabbath. For example, when they said you should rest on the Sabbath and not work, they decided they needed to figure out how many steps you could take on that day without it becoming work. For whatever reason, they calculated that to take anything beyond 50 steps on the Sabbath was work and therefore violated the law. They also said that on those days, you could eat, but you could not cook. You could bandage a wounded person, but you couldn't apply medicine. If you were a woman, you couldn't look in the mirror. Why? Wait for it. Because you might see a gray hair. And if you saw a gray hair, you might be tempted to pluck it out. Plucking out a hair was considered work, and you couldn't work on that day. So no mirrors on the Sabbath. The Bible records that one day on the Sabbath, Jesus did one of the things that the Pharisees had on their list. He picked some grain from a field to eat. The Pharisees jumped all over that to accuse him. Why are you violating the Sabbath? Now, before we get into, how he answered that, Jesus actually did a lot of things. It wasn't just that, picking wheat that he wasn't supposed to do on the Sabbath, like healing people. That was a real big offense to them that he healed people on the Sabbath. That seems mind-boggling because they considered healing work. And the penalty was very serious. So to give how uptight they were, the penalty for a Jewish person who violated the Sabbath, if it was considered purposeful and consistent and egregious, it was the death penalty. I mean, really, stoning. So Jesus taking this on showed you how important straightening out the distortion regarding the Sabbath was. If you want to know the four things that, by the way, that most aroused the religious establishment against Jesus that led to his eventual crucifixion, or the things they accused him of, here they were. He challenged their authority. He mixed with people who were considered unclean or sinners. He broke their laws about Sabbath observance, and then he made claims that he was indeed God's son, the promised Messiah, the Savior of the world. So when they confronted him on his authority, he called them hypocritical and brought their hypocritical lifestyle out into the open. When they confronted him on talking and eating with sinners, he made it clear to them just who he had come to seek and to save. When they rejected his claim to be the Messiah and asked for proof, he simply kept healing, kept performing miracles, kept teaching, and even predicted their murderous plot, but told his followers, wait for that third day. And when it came to breaking the rules on the Sabbath, just such as picking the grain, he had this bombshell reply that struck to the heart of all the decay and disorder within the Pharisaical system. And let me read it. He simply said to them, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was for people. People were not for the Sabbath. So you see what he was trying to reestablish? God gave us the fourth commandment to restore us and not frustrate us. It was never meant to be restrictive, unpleasant, or boring. It's supposed to be a day you look forward to, one that is renewing and inspiring. I love how one author described filling a Sabbath day. He said, eat foods you love to eat. Listen to music that moves your soul. Play a sport that stretches and challenges you. Read books that refresh your spirit. Wear clothes that make you happy. Surround yourself with beauty. And as you do these things, give thanks to God for his wonderful goodness. That's the Sabbath. So set aside a day, rest, renew, and then finally, fourth, and this is the last specific, take some time to reflect, because your renewal needs to be physical, emotional, and spiritual. Work and busyness and fast-paced schedules are at war against spiritual reflection and growth, at war against addressing the deep issues of your life. The Sabbath is not just about filling your physical or your emotional tanks, but filling your spiritual tanks as well. This has been part of the Sabbath since the birth of the church. For example, here's how one Sunday was described, one Sabbath, in the book of Acts in the New Testament. It's called Acts because it chronicles the acts of the early Christian movement. And it says just kind of, in a nondescript way, it says, on the first day of the week, Sunday, we gathered with the local believers to share in the Lord's Supper. Paul was preaching, just kind of a description. To make a day a Sabbath day, though, you see, you have to include time for God. You have to bring God into the time out and let him coach you, encourage you, challenge you, to gather with others for worship, to celebrate the Lord's Supper or Eucharist when it's offered or scheduled. Hear teaching that prompts and encourages and challenges and deepens. With the teaching and voice of Jesus ringing in their ears, the early followers knew to do this, and so should we. So, taking a Sabbath day to rest, renew and reflect is a command for our well-being, as all the commandments are. Built into our lives, it will help us reflect on and draw near to God. It is a gift meant for us to give to ourselves, and it is a gift that we need. Whenever I reflect on this commandment, I remember an old story that I ran across many, many years ago. It was from African colonial history. And it's always stuck with me. There was a traveler who was taking a long journey and had enlisted some of the local tribesmen to assist him in carrying his loads. The first day, they moved fast and they went far. On the second day, the jungle tribesmen refused to move. They just sat, rested. The traveler, who wanted to get on with his journey, asked them why they wouldn't keep going. And they told him they had gone too fast on the first day, that they were now waiting for their souls to catch up with their bodies. Isn't that a great line? That's what God wants for you and why he gave us the fourth commandment. You matter to him. And he knows that every 7 days you need an emotional, physical, spiritual recovery. And that means calling for time, if for no other reason than to let your soul catch up with your body. Okay, well, next week we're going to take a look at the fifth commandment, which is actually one of the more controversial ones because people choke on it so much. It's just difficult. It's the commandment, I'll go ahead and tell you, it's the commandment to honor your parents. And the reason that's a tough one to work through is because so many people have parents who were or are anything but honorable. And so this is just one that they just go, I don't even know how to begin strapping this one on. And even if you had good parents in a good home, what does honoring them really mean? Are there boundaries? Are there limits that you can have? There's a lot to sort through with this one, and we'll do it. We'll strap it on next week. Until then, let me pray for you. Father, thank you so much that you gave us the gift of the seventh day. And instead of fighting it, we should embrace it. What a wonderful thing to put into our lives, the way you meant for it to be in our lives, free of the distortions and the burden, full of the freedom and the renewal. So I pray, Father, that we would take it seriously because it is a commandment. We are to do this for ourselves, but you commanded it for our benefit. So thank you. And I pray all that in Jesus' name. Amen.